Good evening, everyone. That was a great quiet down. Thank you for that. Welcome to the National Museum of American History and to our inaugural American History After Hours event. This is a new program series at the museum where we are looking at intriguing historical topics through modern day approaches, all while enjoying some delicious food and drink, which you will be doing shortly. I'm Susan Evans. I'm the program director of the American Food History Project here at the museum. And tonight we are brewing up history. So sales of craft beer in the United States have been on a steady increase since the 1990s. And in fact, the Brewers Association reported last year that currently the United States has over 3,000 operational breweries, which means that we currently have more breweries right now than at any other time since the 1870s. So how are today's brewers looking to the past of brewing, some of that 1870s and earlier brewing history? And what has really changed or stayed the same in the world of brewing throughout that time period? So with me to discuss this tonight are Greg Engert to my left and Mike Stein. Yes, that's his real name. Greg is the beer director and managing partner for Neighborhood Restaurant Group, which includes Bluejacket, Birch and Barley, Church Key, and many other restaurants around the DC region. Mike is the brewery historian at DC Brow. He's a staff writer at dcbeer.com and the president of Lost Loggers. So we'll be talking for about 30 minutes up here. Then we'll turn it over to you for some questions. And while we are doing that, please feel free to take out your cell phones and tell all of your friends what a great time you're having using the hashtag DCBeer1812. So after we've wrapped up in here, we'll move on to the part you've all been waiting for, and we'll go taste some beers and enjoy some food made by Chef Kyle Bailey of the Arsenal at Bluejacket, and drink some of the beers that we're talking about. There will be objects out of storage, we'll have some exhibitions open, and we can continue the conversation. So with that introduction, I want to start off by asking both of you about a really interesting project you put together in the past year or so, and one that has a really strong historical connection. So last year marked the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Baltimore during the War of 1812. In fact, we have the very flag that inspired the Star-Spangled Banner in this museum. Then that happened during the Battle of Baltimore. So in the spirit of that story and our little historical warm-up, can you tell me a bit about your 1812 Beers project?
Sure. So this is, I promise it's going to be convoluted and complicated. Truly.
That's history.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Mike Stein and I have talked about doing historic collaborations for quite a while now, and I think we probably both thought we would do some kind of pre-prohibition lager or something like that, until Mike brought me some research that our friend Garrett Peck had done about Navy Yard and Navy Yard Brewing, specifically the Washington Brewery, which, though established in 1796 in what is now Foggy Bottom area, moved down to a stone's throw away from where Bluejacket is today in 1806, 5?
4.
4?
Yeah.
That's why he's here. And then operated there until about 1836. So this was intriguing, and even more intriguing was the fact that we only have 2 advertisements, both from the National Intelligencer, that give us any indication about the types of beer that would have been brewed at this place. And there's no recipes, which I found freeing. We weren't just going in and trying to replicate some kind of recipe. And so we set upon utilizing, I think, a lot of our previous research on historic beers. I know I personally drew on my research into English brewing history and started to kind of attack these 2 advertisements and come up with a project that ultimately we'll all get to taste after this.
Yeah. So, like Greg was saying, we had planned to make sort of a historic beer for some time. The question of style was never really a question. We always knew we were going to collaborate. But with these beers that we chose to do, we went sort of back in time, but not just in time, in place, to a very significant place to both of us, Navy Yard. And we had some clues. Obviously, we didn't have a recipe, but we knew the size of the brewery, the Washington Brewery at Navy Yard, which was actually bigger. Their copper was 1,100 gallons, which is bigger than any boiler in DC today, which is kind of humorous. And then we had some other context clues, like Greg mentioned, we're both huge fans of history, so we've read a lot of writings on historical beer, Martin Cornell and Ron Pattison, and we're familiar with their work. But of course their work is primarily based in Britain or England or Scotland, and we wanted to do something that was relevant to DC, where we live and play and work. So we decided on the Washington Brewery at Navy Yard. And then again, the two ads we had, one was from 1811, one was from 1813.
And these were newspaper ads that you found,
Yes,
right? Okay.
absolutely. From the National Intelligencer, like Greg said. So there were three. The first ad from 1811, which was advertised for beer orders to be sold at Daniel Rapine's bookstore, who was the second mayor of D.C., who was decided mayor before we even really had title for mayor. He was a councilman by a coin toss. At his bookstore, you could place an order for a table ale for $3 a keg.
Literally a half barrel.
Literally a half barrel.
15.5 gallons.
It was $4 for strong ale, and then $5 for X ale. And then there are lots of historical arguments about what that entailed. Is that a style? Is that just something a brewery made, and it's more a definition of processes? X ale might have very well been strong ale that just sat longer. There's all this talk of stock ales and mild ales, and then the convoluted nature of style starts.
And that was the fun thing for us. It's like, okay, what if we start with those three? It could literally mean just about anything. I mean, we have these names, and there's a rough reference point as to what it is, but and then cost, which should indicate strength, with or at least original gravity, how much sugar existed beforehand. But just to give you an idea of the different permutations that these terms could mean way back when. And in 1811, 1812, 1813, styles were not really existent. There was no such thing as style. But even the terms we use today meant something different back then. So you had two major families, ale and beer, right? So ale, been around for a very long time. And beer basically is just very well hopped or hopped ale. So ale originally was not hopped until around the 1500s when it comes to British brewing and things like that. But then from those two, you can go colors. So you can have, let's say, pale ale, amber ale, brown ale. No black ale, and we'll talk about why in a second. But you can do the same on the beer side. So they're the same, but just different hopping rates, right? But then you can go to strengths. So for every one of those, pale, amber, brown, ale, or beer, you can have table, which is the lightest, right, the lowest ABV. You can have common, which is stronger, so strong, than the table. And then you can have stout, which would be the strongest. So stout back then just meant strong, right?
And ABV meaning alcohol content, alcohol by volume.
Alcohol by volume, or by weight at that time. So now you have that, okay? And then the last layer is mild, which in those days meant fresh, young. And then a whole host of terms, keeping, stale, which is a positive term, believe it or not.
It's a good thing.
Stock, and then eventually maybe old, meant the same beer aged. And they would do all these things to everything. So when we look at this and see table, strong, and X, it's like X could be a fresh version of probably the strongest of the three, but what color is it? What ABV is it? Strong doesn't mean stronger, but is it X? Is it fresh, or is it K, keeping? So this is kind of like a dead end here for us in many ways. So but we started thinking, okay, well, they're all probably related. And I think that was based on the second advertisement, which we'll talk more about later, wherein it states, there's a guy, John Collett, who buys this brewery in 1811. He's very enterprising man. So buys the brewery, immediately puts an ad out saying these three beers are for sale, okay? And then by 1813, he's advertising the sale of the brewery. He wants to get rid of it. And then he lists everything that's in the brewery's
inventory.
Stocks and inventory.
And now, is that supplies or types of beer that he was
just supplies?
Okay.
So this is where we get new information, and also we find out more about the brew house itself and things like that. In the interim, though, when he first bought the brewery, we know that he bought the lot next door because he intended to expand the brewery, and there was a malt house as well. But lo and behold, people of the Navy Yard, the workers of the Navy Yard, were actually more interested in spirits than beer, and so it didn't seem like a profitable business. And so then he tries to turn around and sell it in 1813. So when we look at that information, that's where we find out that not only do they have an 1,100-gallon kettle, they have a second 500-gallon kettle. So they have two kettles, which I don't think any of us in DC have today. And one of the reason why you'd have two kettles way back when, is to do something called party-style brewing. And party-style brewing is basically, I'll let Mike explain a little bit more about that, but it's basically a way by which you can make many different strengths of beer or ale from one original grain base, grist. Yeah. And so then you can have kind of the same beer 2 ways, 3 ways, 4 ways, 5 ways, the lightest one being the lowest in alcohol, and that's like the last one to be made, and the first runnings being the strongest. And so that kind of got us thinking in a whole different direction.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this type of brewing process that Greg is talking about is even in this point in time in 1811, it's done differently in England than it's done in Scotland. In Scotland, the boil time is much shorter, so they may have produced 2 beers from the same mash, but they're boiling for sometimes as little as 60 minutes. But in the English breweries, in the London breweries, they're mashing for an incredibly long amount of time, and they're boiling for an incredibly long amount of time. I mean, it's the same concept when you make soup or a stock on your stove. If you let it go half an hour, it might be very liquidy, not very viscous. If you let it go an hour, more viscous, an hour and a half, well, you have less broth than you started with, and it's the same concept in beer. So this method just opens a whole nother rabbit hole to jump down, which we dipped a toe in, but we didn't want to go full bore in.
We didn't party-style this.
Right, exactly.
What prevented you from doing that? Why didn't you want to do the whole
have
process?
2 kettles. I mean, so it's
well, also the brewers would have.
That was
killed
all
us.
that was holding you back.
So the last batch was boiled for 4 hours before the 8-hour day. So had we spent 12 hours down in Navy Yard, Bobby and Josh and Owen would have quit. They just would have been so pissed off they would have left. No, but in all seriousness, there's no way to accurately recreate this brewery from 1811. And knowing that at the outset of the project, we made some concessions to history.
And that's an important point. It sounds like there's no real way to recreate it. So can you guys talk a little more about that? What that recreating versus inspiration?
Well, I think this strikes to the heart of what we ended up doing. Basically, creating historic beers is a conundrum. Well, first off, you're never actually recreating a historic beer, right? We're not using copper in our brew house.
Right.
We're not using, grains are completely different today than they were back then. There's a whole host of reasons we don't need to go into, obviously. I think it's pretty clear.
That it's not 1813 anymore.
So, but then on the other side, though, is you do try to make some concessions to get at the flavors of the time. It's not as simple as, I don't think anyways, of saying it's inspired by this. All beers are inspired by some kind of historic, stylistic, precursor. So you start to think about what are the ways, one of the few ways that we can actually create flavors that are not of this era. And then the problem with that, of course, is that those flavors are not of this era. So we might not like the way that they taste. Maybe progress has led us to come up with new techniques and new types of malt. And so this is the conundrum. It's like, how do we make it historically interesting, but not only historically interesting?
And what are some of those tastes that you're talking? When you say it might not be up to our taste, what would it be like?
So anyways, the big one, I think, for me anyways, in the beers you're going to taste, and just so everybody knows too, you're not going to hate all the beers.
We brewed bad beer, but on purpose.
But this is, I think this is the most interesting thing is what we ended up doing to have it both ways. So this party-style system basically ends up meaning that you create one beer, right, and you'd have 2 kettles going. So you mash in your grains, and you send that grain sugar called wort over to one kettle, and you're leaving your grains behind in the water time. Meanwhile, in the other kettle, you're already boiling up your new water that you're going to bring, or not boiling it, but heating it up pretty hot. You're moving that over immediately into the mash tun, whereby you can heat the mash up again and now send more wort over to that kettle from which that hot water just came. So now you got two kettles going, two boils going with wort. The first one, has way more sugar in it than the second one, right? And so then if you do that a third time, now you've got the same beer, but each with decreasing amounts of fermentable sugar. Yeah. And then if you then if you apply the same hopping rate, same yeast, you create 3 beers that just are different strengths, different flavors and intensities, but all related on the same. So that's kind of where we went and decided to say that table, strong, and X were just 3 tiers. X being the first runnings, because it's the most expensive, table being the last. But then we said, okay, how are we going to be historic about this? So Mike found a maltster from England, Thomas Fawcett, right? A 200-year-old maltster. Right. And said they've got this malt that nobody would use today. Yeah. But it's called amber malt, and it gives you literally hardly any sugar. It's very under-modified, so there's not a lot of sugar to ferment. And it's got a pretty big roasted kind of almost acrid character to it. But we were like, this is going to be our historic take on this, and so we decided to use it.
Yeah, I think it should be said, no 200-year-old barley kernel exists today, and if it does, not in the quantities in which modern brewers would use it. Mm-hmm. Bear in mind, all of the modern brewers in DC, whom I love, all of them, just don't have the capacity even at the Washington Brewery at Navy Yard. So this was on a massive scale. And they're malting their own grains, something which is done by very few breweries in the world today, because we've become more efficient at doing it elsewhere and just buying our malt. But this maltster, Thomas Fawcett, has been around for 200 years. And I went as far as to email Mr. Fawcett and say, hey, do you have any records from 1810 to 1814? Of course he didn't. But, I checked all bases.
Tried.
Yeah, we tried.
Which is an important historical story, that's right. How you find out about history, is a lot of dead ends.
Right. Right. So I guess, so of course we didn't do the party child method. What we did instead was create 3 recipes with the exact same malt bill, hop bill, which we can talk about later if we have time or afterwards, and then the same primary yeast, or yeast for primary fermentation. I think the Plato gravities ended up being like 23, 15, and 10. So 23 was just the most sugar, 15, and then 10. And the final ABVs ended up around 8.5% for the first beer, what we'll call X ale, 6.5 for strong ale, and then 2.6 for the table ale.
I think the original gravity of the table was even under 10. It was like
8 or 9.
9,
yeah.
Round to 9.
Yeah.
But our definition, American craft brewers today, our definition of strong is really strong. I mean, we're talking beers over 10%, whereas a premium strong ale in England today might be 6%, right. Which is a lot of the flagship beers around here in DC. We like 6% pale ale. We like 6% whatever, but that's the American palate.
And did you have records historically of what a strong ale percentage-wise would have been comparable? How do you find that out?
Yes, but the hydrometer has only existed.
There you go. Good point.
Right, has only been around since.
Hydrometer is how you measure the sugars in the water. So that's how in the wort. So that's how you know. Like we started with this much sugar, ended up with this much. Now we can calculate alcohol amounts. So if that's from the early 19th century, we didn't really know strength before then, but we can guess the strengths based on the gravities that we had. And I think strength is relative. It goes up and down and up and down. And when you go in and out of wars, for instance, it changes dramatically.
Absolutely.
When you start taxing or restricting how much malt somebody can use, all of a sudden, your definition of strength can go from 8 to 4 pretty
and
quickly.
Of course.
So are you suggesting there's some sort of War of 1812 link here that we just don't know?
There is.
There was there was limits on what you could get.
I'll say this. Taxes were very important to what was America in 1811, as they were in England, and there's a beer tax. England is just coming out of the Napoleonic Wars. They're still involved in them. And the point is that we always talk about the Reinheitsgebot, the German purity law. Well, England had a purity law too. France had Paris. There was a Paris purity law. But we know about the German one because it's been intact for so long.
And can you just explain what that is, if people are
Sure.
not familiar with it?
So the Reinheitsgebot determined that all German beer should only be made with 3 ingredients: water, hops, and barley. They didn't know about yeast, pure yeast culture at the time, so yeast wasn't listed as one of the ingredients. But the Brits had a law as well, in I think it was 1811, saying that all British beer must be made from the same ingredients. The fourth with yeast, and they couldn't use sugar or molasses or treacle or honey or any of those ingredients that the British brewers could have used, as well as the Scottish brewers. And that's really interesting because the Washington Brewery at Navy Yard is housed in the old sugar mill, in the old sugar factory, where of course there would have been a history of making sugar and molasses and the other byproducts. So it's very interesting in terms of local history, how that varied from the Anglo-British, Scottish world.
And also we know from other recipes of the time that molasses were used in a lot of American brewing. Part of the reason for that is just the fact that the Mid-Atlantic at that time was not, and still is not, a hotbed of grain growing. Right. So you had to find your sugar source from someplace. And so to that end, not only did we use, Maris Otter Pale Malt, which is an English malt that's modern, amber malt, we use some molasses. We use a little bit of chocolate malt, some Special W, which is also a pretty intense, slightly acrid and roasty malt. That's Belgian. But just trying to go to the flavors. But what I think is very important is that at some point we decided to maybe go more historic, if I can say that, on these 3 in some ways, i.e. like, let's stop worrying about necessarily like how it's going to taste to the modern palate, and let's go a little bit more historic on these because we started referencing that second advertisement more. And in that advertisement, so John Collett decides he wants to sell the brewery. And so now this is where we find out that he's got 2 kettles and a malt house. This is where we find out he's got 500 bushels of barley and malt, which is roughly like 24,000 pounds or so. Yeah. So we find out he's got 2,000 pounds of hops on hand, which would have been whole cone hops. So a lot more than you might expect. I mean, that's a lot of hops on hand, actually, for the time. Yeah. But it's also where we find out that he's got ale and porter. So those are the 2 general categories mentioned. And a huge stock of barrels, oak barrels, in all sizes, too. So like half barrels.
Hogsheads, visors, leagues. I mean, these are just
pipes and tons.
Wonderful, early 19th
describe
century words for
shapes of
different
barrels.
size of barrels. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And we know that there wasn't any stainless steel in the brewing industry until the 50s. Keg beer is 1960s. So back then, you're filling oak barrels, half barrels or barrels, and sending it out and pouring from them. But he also had pipes and tons, which are like 125 gallons to 250 gallon giant oak kind of foeders that you see today, vats. Yeah. So we start thinking about porter. We start thinking about vats. We start thinking about aging beer. And then, depending on who you believe, there's kind of a little debate going on about what porter once was.
It's very hot in the historic beer nerd circle right now.
So on one side you have, so we chose to go with Ron Pattinson, who is on the side of sour, okay? Yes. Because now we're starting to think like, well, wait a minute, maybe we're going to make these 3 beers. We'll make that table beer, we'll make that ale, and we'll make that strong ale, and we'll make them pretty historically accurate, malt-wise. But at the end of the day, let's create one interpretation of what porter would have been in the early 19th century, and that's a blend of ale. Typically a blend of ale, part of which is aged and therefore soured, and likely funky from the fermentation, secondary fermentation of any number of Brettanomyces strains, which is a cousin to ale yeast, lager yeast, Saccharomyces, that creates kind of funky flavors and it dries beer out. And let's say that maybe what we'll do is we'll brew all 3 of these threads, and then we'll create a master porter blend. But knowing that we didn't necessarily have enough time to let this part of the blend age naturally and sour naturally and get funky from Brettanomyces naturally, just from spontaneity of fermentation, we said, let's dress up those threads a little bit too. So we took the X ale, which is the strongest, and it came out 8.5%. We said, we're not going to manipulate that. We'll leave that as a sort of barley wine of sorts, right? Then we took the 6.5% middle road one, and we spiked that with Brettanomyces lambicus, which is typically found in it's the funkier producing flavor strain that we find in Lambic from Brussels and the Piemonte. And we spiked that in the middle one, so that got really dry and really funky and wild. And then with that 2.6% table beer, we said, you know what, let's hit that with some lactobacillus, which is the positive bacteria that gives us really great tartness. And then we'll have 3 kind of strains of beer that are interesting and weird and wild on their own, maybe even historically evocative. But at the end of the day, we know we can create a final blend, our homage to the early 19th century porter, that is going to be much more to our modern palates.
So could you talk a bit about that blending process and what, how blending would have worked in that time period and why, you're saying why you chose to do it now, but how is it different now?
As Greg was mentioning, there's this debate about whether or not stock ale was sour, tart, funky.
So stock ale, porter, same thing, or are those two different things?
A porter could very well be a stock ale. That depends on the brewery, specifically in history.
Okay. Stock's just like, an aged beer.
It just means it's sat. But just to fast forward to go from 1811 to 1911, stock ale is probably a lager that's been sitting in these German lager beer breweries, but they might still call it stock ale. Confusing, I know.
It wouldn't be sour at all.
And wouldn't be tart at all. It would be very clean, made with a pure Pastorianus, a lager yeast culture. What we found in that 1813 ad is that beyond all the visors, leagues, hogsheads, and these massive vats and small little kegs, all wooden, there were casks of vinegar. So why would a brewery be holding casks of vinegar? I mean, it says random in ingredient as a sugar or molasses. Why didn't they put that in the ad as well? Well, I suspect that some of those casks, serving casks, kegs, had turned to vinegar because they'd been stock ale, stock porter, perhaps, for too long. So did we want to recreate vinegar? No. I mean, we could have done that. But the point is, when we drink sour ale, we like it to have an incredible complexity and a depth. And what a better way to do that than by creating 3 unique ales and blending them together to create a porter. And that's kind of where the notion came about.
And it was also, for the blend, we had, so at Bluejacket we have 3 incredible brewers who are the heart and soul of that brewery, and their names are Josh Chapman, Owen Miller, and Bobby Bump. So they, Mike actually sat in on a couple of the brew days, I think, but the 5 of us got together, and then Mike Tonsmeyer is here as well. He'll be outside signing his book on sours. We invited him in because he knows quite a bit about
we invited the man who literally wrote the book, American Sour Beer. I mean, that's the title of the book, and he'll be here tonight signing books. But we invited him because we knew his palate is kind of par none. He's traveled all over the world, all over the country, to California and to Texas, all over to these sort of renowned American sour beer breweries. And these sour breweries are convening with history in a sense that they're making beer that was as tart as turn of the 19th century stock ale, but of course their ingredients are very 21st century, and their methods are very 21st century. And they don't have to let a beer sit for 6 months to get it nice and tart.
So So I think we did like 8 or 10, 12 different blends.
I think it was 8 blends.
Tasted them out, and then we ended up doing the final blend, which we loved, with 25% of that table beer, and then the rest of it split evenly between the other 2 threads.
Yep.
Right.
Yep, that's right. And so we kind of got there by doing, okay, we're just going to start with 2 strands and see what that's like. We blended the 2. Okay, well, we definitely want to add the table beer because we know that's tart and funky. Then we did 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Well, this is too earthy, too terra firma. Let's bring in some tartness. So it was like, a 1/6, a 6 2/3, or whatever it was. And eventually just got the ratio right. But it took 8 separate concoctions of just taking, 12 ounces of beer, a small amount, and blending them, 3 ounces, 3 ounces, 3 ounces, or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it was a process. But that's something when you buy, the beer we love, a Russian River beer, a Jester King beer, a Cantillon beer, that's all behind the scenes. They don't, I mean, sometimes they'll put it in marketing what the blend is, but
yeah, trust that it's blended. Yeah,
right, right, exactly.
It doesn't come out perfect from barrel anytime necessarily. So, I think so. I mean, so we ended up with this more modern sour, but still it's got a lot of malt character. It's very funky. It's about 6% alcohol, really tasty, and a cool homage, like you said, to that kind of original early 19th century porter style.
Yeah.
Awesome. So as we're thinking about wrapping up the conversation, how do you think that your dive deep into history here will be impacting what you do as brewers moving forward?
I will never use amber malt again.
Learning from the past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it's really fun. It's I don't know. I think it's the stuff that we think about every day.
Mm-hmm.
So I love to do more of this stuff and keep learning about the way that the flavors can be manipulated and do get manipulated and things like that. And it's just great. Honestly, like creativity needs some bounds for me. Like otherwise, you're just like it's chaos. Like what do you make tomorrow? So this was a great thing to focus us on this project to create beers that we never would have made had we not seen these two advertisements and spoken together about them, and then sat down with the brewers and created these recipes. And I think that's the most rewarding part for us.
Yeah, for me, I think it's just convincing as many brewers as I can to keep using amber malt. No, I'm just kidding.
To let Mike in their brew house.
No, which I'll say, Jeff from DC Brow is here, and we did a great beer just with amber and brown and Maris Otter malt this summer. So I think the way we learn is we take what's good about the past and we leave what's bad behind, and then we funnel that creativity into a brewing project. So, what's next or what's for the 21st century is looking back through the centuries, taking the best and maybe offering a flavor experience that is very palatable to the modern palate, but is also evocative of what the palate was like in the 19th
At the time.
century.
And I'd say the last thing is that, we're not trying to be definitive here. Obviously, we're not saying this is what beer tasted like back then. Nobody should ever say that. But, we're starting a conversation. We should all, I think, be interested in, was porter tart? Was it not? Was it funky and breaded? I think these conversations are fun to have, and I think that these beers make you think about them. And it's another way to drink beer rather than just being, 100 points or, this one's better than that one, is to create an experience that's not just visceral, but maybe a little bit more intellectual.
Yeah.
And a great jumping off point into other ideas that are beyond the glass.
Well, I really appreciate from the historic perspective of how you guys really dove deep into what was happening in the past and made it something that makes us think about how history really influences the experiences that we're having today. So with that, I want to leave time for some questions. If you do have questions, there are 2 microphones at either side of the seats there. It's a packed house, so make friends with your neighbors and kind of scooch on out to the microphone. And we'll just take a few questions before we turn everybody out to try some of the things that we just talked about. So our first question is right over here. I think they should be on. Yeah, go ahead. I can hear you, so I'll repeat it. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Just.
Drinking sour beer and avoiding problems with somebody that's diabetic?
So I think the question...
Is there a lower glucose or glycogen
So I think the
index?
question is about sugar levels, probably, in a beer. So what, and how, if the sour beer maybe has a lower sugar
Sure.
level than a
I'm
different
happy
beer.
to handle that. So I'm actually a type 1 diabetic. I have been since I was 7, so I've had it for a few decades now. And I'll say that generally speaking, the better attenuated beer is better for the blood sugar.
Attenuated, can you say,
Attenuated.
what does that mean?
So attenuation, right? When a beer is really dry, it's well attenuated, and that means there isn't a lot of residual sugar. The yeast has eaten that eaten that sugar and converted it into alcohol. With these big, rich styles like Russian Imperial Stout and barley wine and old ale, you can taste the sweetness, and that will jack your blood sugar up, no doubt about it. The better attenuated beers, Pilsners, Berliner Weiss that's been sitting for years, that's very attenuated with lactobacillus, perhaps with Brettanomyces, that is, in theory, better for a diabetic because you can have 12 ounces of it, and it's only, 10 carbs. Comparatively to 12 ounces of barley wine, that's going to be like 20 or 30 carbs, depending on how much maltose, dextrins are inside of it.
But at the same time, glucose, I mean, you can have a beer that's lowly attenuated that's really sour too. So it's not lactobacillus doesn't just convert sugar out into, I mean, when we make our sours, we use a particular kind of lacto strain called brevis most of the time because we find it's able to drop the pH and acidify the wort without converting too much of the sugar. We want to leave that sugar to be fermented out by Brettanomyces or other kinds of yeasts later on. So that's why you can have really sweet and sour beers. I think like Rodenbach Classic or Duchesse de Bourgogne kind of tastes like sweet and sour, and that's for that reason. Then you can have bone dry, heavily acidic beers like Cantillon Lambic. That's going to be bone dry and super sour too. So go either way.
If no one's ever experienced what a dry beer tastes like, I think you will have that experience probably when you taste them because it's.
And we have among those and other beers that we brought too.
Yeah. All right. Another question over here.
Sure. Well, we know that hops, barley, and malt are grown in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Germany, a number of European countries, but also in the States. Can you say something about where the ingredients came from for the historic beers, and where do they come from now, and what effect does that have on the quality and the taste of the beer?
So where the ingredients were being grown historically, where are the ingredients you guys are using in your brews today?
Yeah.
So that's a great question. How do ingredients affect taste in the end product? The answer is very much so. We didn't use any really Czech or German, Eastern European ingredients. And it's also a great mystery, too. They had a ton of malt and a ton of hops. Where did they get all those from? Obviously, if you go back to historical record, you learn, George Washington at some point is against the English porter and is in favor of porter from Philadelphia, and then it's made at home in his estate. So there's this shift in ingredients and how ingredients might even reflect patriotism or nationalism.
Ooh, a whole other lecture.
Yeah, sorry. But getting back to that question,
love that topic.
Ingredients do drastically affect flavor.
And I think so. And of course, it's hard to say exactly what we know. Obviously, English exportation still existed at the time, so we were still importing. So we used some English malts. That's why we didn't use like German or Czech malts or things like that. We did use some locally grown wheat, unmalted wheat, not because necessarily it was going to be a part of that recipe in the old days, but to try to show that there probably would have been some influence of locally grown grain in the beer. And then one of the amazing chefs I get to work with all the time, his name is Nathan Anda. He's a butcher too. Red Apron, The Partisan, B-Side, he's incredible. He smoked some malt for us on his smoker. So just showing that how the malt house would have dried some malt probably and smoked it right next door,
Yes.
but probably wouldn't have been doing it with hickory, cherry, and apple wood.
Right. So
But we incorporated that, but in a very modern way as well.
And that malted wheat came from Virginia, from the northern neck of Virginia. Now, of course, in the malt house, they wouldn't have said, like cherry wood, I want some oak, they wouldn't have said, let me take 3 woods because this will make a beautifully delicate smoke. I mean, it was what was available, right? And so that's where the 21st century said, we'll use some local malt, but we'll use, a gentleman who's known for being an excellent butcher and a great smoker, and therefore he'll smoke our malt, and we'll have this, unique product.
Great question. So we're going to take 2 more questions before we head out. So you, right over here, I think you were up there next.
We'll keep our answers short.
Hi, my name is Jake Grover. I'm a DC homebrewer. First, I want to thank Greg and Mike for your valuable contributions to the DC beer community. It's truly appreciated.
Thank you.
Second, I would highly encourage everyone to buy a copy of Mike Tonsmeyer's book. It is truly an encyclopedia of knowledge on sour beers in America. Finally, I'm really interested in the choice of wild yeast that you guys utilized. Given that Bluejacket is one of the few American breweries with a coolship, I'm a bit surprised that you guys did not utilize local microflora that would have presumably mimicked what got into the beer back in the 1810 period. Can you guys explain that choice a little bit more?
I can. So the coolship, we did a lot lot of this brewing in the summertime.
July.
So we would never be pulling or attempting to pull airborne yeast and bacteria out of the air at that time, just because when it gets hot, the possibility for really nasty infections to occur are high. That's why seasonal brewing existed before everybody stopped using cool ships. So until the 1860s, you brewed from October to March, largely because if you brewed in the summertime, the beer would be unpalatable or worse. So it's kind of a timing thing. Were we brewing these now, we absolutely would do that because we've actually pulled wild yeast bacteria, ale yeast out of the air. We've separated it out, and we're growing cultures of it now. So in the future, that'll definitely be something that would probably we'd incorporate into our historic beers.
And I think the cool ship story and what Bluejacket is doing with that is also very interesting and maybe something you can talk about when we're afterwards. Got it. One last question over there. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Could you say something about how the beers you're trying to recreate were originally consumed? Were they consumed at home or in the pub, on special occasions or daily, with meals, not with meals, men, women, one at a time, eight at a time?
No, I think that's a great question that we
Sure.
didn't really get to, but
Sure.
it's an important one. Who
Yeah.
is drinking these beers and how were they drinking them?
All right, 10 seconds on the clock.
Yep,
10 seconds.
got
Men,
it.
women, children.
Go, I'm timing.
We can talk more later.
Yeah, but I think, no, that's a really good point, because when we think about scale, these beers were of a massive size. But the interesting thing that these beers are being sold at a bookstore, to read the ad, you have to be literate. And America is nowhere near as literate as it was in 1811 as it is today. It's not as populated. And so I think this connection, this notion we have with beer as a sort of, the common everyman spirit, this might be a sort of twist in that narrative.
Right.
Because...
And maybe the spirits were the common thing. And
Right.
the beers were-
Whiskey was huge.
Yeah.
Garrett Peck, our friend, makes the argument in his book that the reason that John Collette is selling his brewery in 1813 is because whiskey is king,
Yeah.
beer is out, nobody wants to drink beer anymore, whiskey's cheaper, you can consume it, you get more bang for your buck.
That's right.
All of those things. But it's interesting, too, if you talk about where it's being consumed, in taverns, of course, in pubs, but also beer at this point in time in America is also very much a women's domain.
Yeah.
And that's important to note because the Washington Brewery was really following the Scottish-English model of sort of industrial scale brewing. But there very, very, very well may have been more brewers brewing at home at that time.
Like the nano brewers.
Right, because one of the other breweries, the two others in 1811 that are allowed, Hereford and Bussard's, are selling malt and yeast to the public. When they're advertising their beer for sale, they're also advertising their malt.
Home brewers.
Yeah, the Washington Brewery did not advertise malt and yeast that we know in those National Intelligencer articles. But it's important to know that it really took a long time for the industrialization of beer to get going. I mean, America was very much a home brew country at that point in time.
Mm-hmm. There seems like there are so many topics around this beer history idea that we could have an entire series at the American History Museum about beer history.
Sounds good.
And you can all come back for that. See? So, thank you all for coming. I'm going to turn it over to Greg, who will explain what is going to happen in terms of beer. And I do want to remind everyone that we are doing an event every month this year, except we're taking the summer off, so almost every month, looking at different topics in history. So next month, we'll be looking at the craft distilling revolution and what's happening in distilling, so maybe even touching on that whiskey popularity story. And we invite you to come back, and thank you very much for your enthusiasm for the topic. And Greg will let you know how this is going to work.
Okay, so real quick, when we go outside, Kyle's got a bunch of great food. You'll see that when you first go through. So if there's a huge line forming and you want to drink first, you can just skirt the line, okay? That's the way it was set
Around
up.
the food. too,
Right.
Greg.
On one side, we're going to be pouring the blend, the porter blend, you're going to pick up a glass first when you go out. Then you'll see the food, then the beer. Pouring the porter blend into your glass. But then also we have pre-poured little samples of the 3 threads after. And then on the other side, I couldn't help myself. I brought 3 other beers from Bluejacket. A barley wine called High Society that we aged in James E. Pepper bourbon barrels to showcase a different kind of exhale for today. And then a new sour we have called Mothra that tastes really great to show you a kind of more contemporary sour. And then just to pound afterwards, Forbidden Planet, which is a good Kolsch that we make.
If you want to try a very dry highly attenuated beer with mixed cultures, Brettanomyces and Lactobacillus. Mothra is a beautifully dry sort of farmhouse saison. That beer is dry, beautifully dry.
And there, as we mentioned, Michael Tonspear is signing his book. We have some objects from the collections out of storage on display, and our exhibition, Food Exploring the American Table, 1950 to 2000, is also open. So with that, thank you all very much. We really appreciate being part of the conversation.